The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Zero Squared is the Zero Books podcast. Jesse Singal is a contributing writer at New York Magazine, and his work has appeared in the New York Times, Slate, the Boston Globe, the Daily Beast, and other outlets. He is also one of the most hated men on the internet and the target of a perpetual defamation campaign. He is the co-host of the podcast Blocked and Reported and the author of a new book called The Quick Fix. Jesse, welcome to the Zero Books podcast and video stream and all of that.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you, and I'm glad to get to talk to you about really your book. I contacted you because you were featured in Quillette recently as a target for harassment and defamation, and I wanted to have you on to talk about that. But it turns out you have this new book called The Quick Fix, and it's right up my alley. In fact, one of the readers at Zero Books wrote a book called The Semiotics of Happiness a while back. It's all about the happiness industry and the way happiness became a political target.
Yeah.
And when reading your book, I was reminded of Ashley Frawley and her work. So you might want to check that out. But it's something that I've been sort of aware of for years. In general, what your book is about is the psychology industry or the ideas factory. And one of the things that it starts with is this implicit bias study and how that's impacted our politics and the way we think about race. It also, I think, touches upon the replication crisis that's going on in the realm of psychology and sociology. But how would you describe your book?
Yeah, I mean, the whole point of the book is to look at these. Every few years, there's some new exciting TED Talk idea that hits the stage and then hits the national stage and becomes very popular, and there's books written about it and research funding. These ideas usually claim that they're going to help us solve some pressing problem. So Amy Cuddy told us that if women power posed, if they sort of stood there like Wonder Woman, that would help reduce gender gaps in the workplace. Angela Duckworth taught us that grit is sort of a way of measuring passion and stick-to-itiveness that could help reduce educational inequality. And then the IAT, as you mentioned, the implicit association test is sort of it's fading out a little now, but it has been the way to talk about race in America for, 8 years or so, maybe longer. It's been around in one form or another since 1998. What all these ideas have in common, I argue, is that they take these very complicated sort of difficult problems that we've been dealing with for a long time, and they say, here's this like relatively simple fix to them. If you can measure and fix people's implicit bias, we'll get over racial discrimination. If women can feel more powerful, if we can just do that, we'll deal with workplace gender equity issues. And, I look at things from a more structural perspective. I think there's a reason these problems are difficult to solve, and we get seduced by quick fixes because they don't ask much of us. And most importantly, they often don't really require any redistribution, which is usually how you actually solve problems.
Yeah. Well, yeah, this is what I was going to mention. It seems to me that maybe the problem is inherent to the field of study that's generating the ideas. When you're coming out of psychology, you're going to be focusing on the individual and individual behavior, and individual ideas or attitudes. So it makes sense that if you're trying to solve social problems through a psychological lens or through a psychological approach, that these are going to be the kinds of things that you come up with.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. It's also there's been especially in social psychology, there's been a trend toward measuring individuals in lab situations because that is the easiest way to generate data, which you need to publish. It isn't automatically true that like a field of a subfield of psychology has to sort of zoom in on individuals. I mean, social psychology at its best theorizes about how other people influence us and how structures influence us. The most popular and sort of well-funded psychology tends to be very individualistic, though. And the problem is you go from an individual pecking at a keyboard, measuring their implicit bias, and then you think about the real-world settings where racism raises its head, employment, housing, and all that. And the question is a question of what psychologists would call external validity. How much can we really say your reaction time on a computer-simulated task has anything to do with the real world?
Do you think this is going to be a question that we can take up again later on? But do you think that the dominance of social media is also helping to fuel the popularity of these kinds of ideas or is that just a correlation and not a causation?
I do like that you can blame literally anything on social media. I'm a fan of doing that. In this case, I think there's something to it because the rise of these ideas, this is a 21st century phenomenon. It's come at the same time. Journalism has both expanded in one sense but collapsed in another. There are more outlets than ever before, other than traditional newspapers, more web outlets, and they're all trying to feed the maw of the voracious content beast. And I was a science editor basically at New York Magazine for the website there for Science of Us, and we had to produce counterintuitive psychological findings for our audience. That was our job. And there actually aren't that many good studies that deserve to be written up. And yet, if you're a journalist, you face pressure to post several times a day. So I do think that's part of it.
I was thinking about how social media outlets like Twitter or Facebook focuses on the individual and feeds a desire to call out the individual or cancel the individual, but to think about your own. It also incentivizes you to present yourself as a kind of commodity or in a particular way to give yourself a moral sheen, and for people to go through their feeds picking out who are good people and who are bad people, and to think of social issues in terms of all these little individual heads that pop up on Twitter or on Facebook. Yeah. So it even though it brings everyone together, it also atomizes people in a strange way.
There's a book called The Age of Fracture by a historian named Daniel Rogers, and his whole theory is that mid-century America, which certainly had its flaws. You would not necessarily want to be, black or openly gay in mid-century America, but back then people understood themselves as parts of these big communities and these big social forces. You were much more likely to be, really be a member of a church or a union or to have strong religious ties. His argument is everyone's getting more atomized. So now we're just individuals floating around in markets, and we have to optimize ourselves and promote ourselves as sort of competitive. And I think that ties into what's going on in my book and the stories I tell. And I think that's, if you haven't read that, that's sort of another version of what you're saying, I think.
Yeah, I read you got me the book. I just got into it this morning, actually, because the book came to me a little late. I read the beginning and the end of it, so.
I meant Age of Fracture as a general recommendation for
okay.
My book. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I'm calling you out for having not read the whole book.
Yeah. So let me ask you this: what is Prime World? That's a concept that comes up in your book. What is it, and how important is it to this phenomenon of the quick fix?
I basically posit Prime World as a worldview in which society is like pretty okay as it is, but all we really have to do is figure out the primes and biases that are affecting people. A prime is this idea, mostly from psychology, that these studies have all collapsed because of the replication crisis, but you see a photo of an old person, so you'll slow down and walk like an old person. They sound sort of magical, but this is what social psychologists believe for a long time. In this worldview, psychologists can provide us these cute little interventions to fix our primes and biases, and that will help really address racism and gender inequity and inequality. And my argument is that is like a pretty myopic way of understanding the world. I think at the margins, the classic example of this is one of the superstars of social psychology, a guy named John Bark. He writes in his book that when it's warm out, people believe in global warming. When it's cold, they don't. They're unconsciously influenced by the weather. And there's a tiny sense at the margins in which that's true based on public opinion data. But no, people believe in global warming or they don't because of their media consumption habits, because of what their friends believe. So to me, that's a really good example where it's a psychologist pops up and says, oh, what's going on here is people are primed to believe in it when the weather is warm. And we could probably fix that when, no, people believe what they believe for much firmer rooted reasons.
Yeah, and the global warming example is a really good example of the limits of worrying about people's individual attitudes and beliefs, because regardless of how much belief there is in global warming, it seems like, from my perspective, someone who's watched the battle around the issue rage for a couple of decades, more than a couple of decades now, that how much attention and concern there is about it in the general population doesn't ultimately determine what's done about it. Yeah. So given that that's the case, we shouldn't be that concerned about changing people's attitudes. I think a lot of times on the left, people are very quick to celebrate shifting the Overton window, right? Or celebrating the changes in attitudes, as if that in and of itself will lead to political change.
I make the same point in my chapter on racism, because in 2021 there's still some people with explicitly racist beliefs, but we've mostly won that war, and it took a long time. You look at the graph; it takes years. Even things like interracial marriage. I'm recording this from my parents' nice, leafy white suburb in Newton. Everyone has the right beliefs about race, but how many of them would allow low-income housing to be built here, or mixed-income housing? How many of them we have a gleaming new high school, new meaning like a decade or two old, that's like, hundreds of millions of dollars? Would they give that up? Would they let someone else's kids have access to those resources? That's why I'm jaded on the current fixation that we just need to get everyone to have the right beliefs or to raise their consciousness. The whole Robin DiAngelo thing acts as though really what's preventing racial justice is white liberals don't think the right thing. And I just find that so disconnected from the reality of how racism and inequality work, frankly.
So let's go through some of the fads that you talk about in your book, because that's the fun part, I think, is to mock and ridicule these fads and trends.
No, I think the fun part is the in-depth statistical methodological stuff, but we can
okay. All right. Well, you're a better man than I.
Let's talk p-hacking.
So like what are your favorite trends, or the most ridiculous trends that really did gain some dominance? I guess the implicit bias test itself is sort of ridiculous. I've taken it. I know you have too, right?
I am slightly biased against white people, so scientifically not racist. What'd you get?
I got that I was biased against black people the first time I took it, and white people the second time I took it.
That's one of the problems.
I fixed my responses. I said, I see what I'm doing. I'm going to change how I behave. It took me longer the second time.
Yeah.
The first time I took it, here's a little story about it. I was at work, and I worked in a phone room, and my boss allowed us to kind of goof around from time to time, and you could take the implicit bias test online. This is a while back, and I was the strident leftist in the room, right? Everyone knew that I was the politically correct one. I was always the one scolding people. And so we all took the implicit bias test, and I was the only one who came out with a bias against black people.
Wrecked.
I was totally wrecked, and people did not let me forget about it. One of my boss had a black son. He married a woman who had a black son, and he said, "I'm not going to let my kid come around you anymore, Doug." So, it was a humiliation. But then I took it again at home under controlled circumstances, and I biased against white people.
As you should be. We're terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah, the IIT has gotten a lot of attention. I also liked writing the chapter on grit, which is, it's supposedly this new way of measuring how conscientious you are. It's really just a proxy for conscientiousness, which is like a well-established psychological construct. There's an argument Angela Duckworth, the superstar social psychologist behind grit, never really came up with anything new. To me, that tied so much into the sort of pathological ways we look at things like educational inequality, because if you think about what it's like to go to a school that doesn't have resources and go home to an unstable home life and to not have enough to eat, to not have access to good jobs, the idea that you would look at that constellation of problems and say, what's missing here is grit, to me is something you could only really believe if you're from, I don't really like to do the privilege thing, but I do think if you're from a privileged setting where everyone has worked hard and done well as a result, it's easy to, put blinders on. So to me, grit is a really interesting example of social psychology sort of like intersecting with particularly American pathologies and producing something that there's a kernel of truth there. I'd rather have someone be gritty than not gritty, but grit is not the reason low-income kids are falling behind in school. It's much more complicated than that and much harder to solve.
Yeah, and maybe a lack of grit may be a symptom of a lot of other problems.
Yeah.
Perhaps. What about self-esteem? That's you bring that up in your book, and I'm old enough to remember when self-esteem was sold to the schools in the 80s. Is that about when it started? Because when I was in high school, we had to go to assemblies and watch films about how we should have more self-esteem, which I thought, how am I supposed to do that when I can't get a date? I mean, this does not solve my problem. But anyway, how did that get sold to the schools, and how did that become popular?
There's a California state assemblyman named John Vasconcellos, who sort of like a spiritual searcher, California hippie type. He reads a book by a guy named Nathaniel Branden, who is an acolyte and lover of Ayn Rand. I mean, lover in the sexual sense. This book is about self-esteem. John Vasconcellos was, he had a big mind. He would get fixated on stuff. He convinces himself and many other people that self-esteem is the root of all sorts of social ills, that criminals don't have good self-esteem, kids not doing well in school don't have self-esteem. And he convinces the governor of California to give him, I think, like $350,000 a year for 5 years or something like that, to create a California commission on self-esteem. And at first, everyone ridicules it. But once the ball gets rolling, this idea really goes viral to the point where, like you said, all over the country, schools really emphasize self-esteem. And it was based on this really shoddy correlational research where people would be like, people with self-esteem do better in school. But, there are multiple problems with that. One is in some of the studies, people would self-report how they did in school. And people with high self-esteem tend to overstate themselves. So that's sort of a obvious confound. At the end of the day, there just wasn't that much evidence to suggest this simple causal story where self-esteem causes good or bad outcomes. But in part because America is such like a land of self-help and magical thinking, this idea dominated for a very long time and probably made a lot of money for a lot of people.
Yeah, and the fact that it got into the public schools, to me, really speaks to some sort of major problem, that there should be some sort of filter for bullshit that just isn't up around our institutions.
I think just about every idea in my book got into public schools. I mean, that's like the first place. When there's an exciting new idea, that's the first population you unleash it on. But I agree with you.
But I experienced it personally, so it matters more.
Exactly.
But so the other thing that is of interest there is that this is a right-wing concept from the start, comes out of a Randian's perspective. But now I feel as though that notion of self-esteem being very important is very much embraced by at least the progressive left side of the spectrum. That you like, one of the reasons we should have elected Hillary Clinton was to provide girls with more self-esteem.
There's this very interesting, the way it's morphed into this sort of religious belief in the power of representation, where unless you see, it's easy for me to say this, I'm a Jewish white male, we are overrepresented in media, but it's like, it's like if women don't see a female president, they won't understand there can be one, almost, which is, there's probably some element. We should obviously have a female president for multiple reasons, but people seem to really latch on to that idea that unless they see some representation of who they are or want to be, they're like not. I often see it treated as like a matter of validity. Like there was a Vox article by a biracial writer saying that basically an adult saying like she didn't quite feel valid because Netflix didn't do biracial representation right. And it's weird how much people rely on sort of mass media for their sense of self. And I think that's part of the problem. And it might point to low self-esteem, actually.
But, okay, so if we're going to be consistent here, then the fact that people don't feel represented, or they don't, that they're seeking representation to validate themselves, may be as inconsequential really as them having high self-esteem, or you know what I'm saying? Like, if it may be that we're just talking about stuff that doesn't really matter at all.
I mean,
right?
I think what you probably follow lefty dysfunction more than I do, but I think one of the problems, just to tie my book more into sort of the zero books world, is like there is sort of an obsession with pop culture and the media, which doesn't mean those aren't important things, but like, I mean, maybe I spend too much time on Twitter, but I've seen people like claim unironically that South Park is one of the reasons for a worldwide rise in anti-Semitism. There's this real like whatever media I consume is having a massive impact on the world.
Right.
Pepe Le Pew and rape culture, stuff like that. So
Yeah, I do think that's somehow tied into this, maybe the overall notion of that of prime world more than maybe the self-esteem thing particularly. So yeah, and the recent cancellation of Dr. Seuss was similarly justified along similar lines. It's if kids see these images of Chinese people in Dr. Seuss on page 15, they will have low self-esteem, feel unrepresented by the culture, and have bad outcomes socially in their life because of it.
Right. And that's silly because you can make a perfect, like, the books that got canceled, one of them was like pretty racist. It had like the African tribesmen or whatever. You can make a perfectly coherent.
Well, I would just point out that book was not racist. That image was racist.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So do you even need to ban the whole thing? But I'm saying you don't even need to go this whole moral panic, what about the children thing to justify like, okay, maybe we should redo that image. Maybe we should do something. But yeah, it does tend to come back to like, what will this do to the children, which people tend to freak out about children who, children, if you give them food and water and some nurturing, tend to be okay in the end.
Yeah, all of my kids are alive, so it shows that you don't have to be particularly confident.
Are they racist because you exposed them to Dr. Seuss at a young age?
No, that's not why they're racist. No, no, they're not racist. I have 4 kids. 2 of them are adults now, and 2 of them are still at home, and I guess technically one's 18, he's an adult. And we all read them all Dr. Seuss, including one of the books that's just got taken off the shelves. The one that the moment I remember running into trouble with old children's media was Peter Pan by Disney. There's a whole number of what makes the red man red.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and like my kid Ben, the oldest kid, loved Peter Pan, loved that song, and I kind of inwardly flinched a little bit about it because it's dawned on me that was not exactly politically correct. It was a kind of a racist number, but he had no context for that, and it didn't impact his attitudes about Native people or Indians or anything like that. Yeah. But if he'd been older than 3 when he was into Peter Pan, which he wasn't, I might have talked to him about the representation of Indians and how old the film was that he was watching and how attitudes had changed. It would have been like one of those teachable moments.
Totally.
Yeah, and I feel like the same thing's true with these Dr. Seuss books. Like,
there's nothing wrong with arguing that we should put them in cultural context. To me, there's this very neurotic, panicky idea that sort of fleeting racist jokes or imagery can on their own make people racist or really sort of corrupt young souls. And that, to me, that is sort of a prime world type thing where you're just like overstating the influence of just these random extraneous stimuli that don't matter that much.
Right. I mean, like to give another example, when the statues were being toppled last summer, I felt that it represented a failure of the movement to turn in that direction. Not because I was for the statues, but because there was this logic of, if we get rid of the statues, then we will be changing the structural racism of society. It's like the symptomatic statue, you can get rid of it, but something else will come up. It's like you have to treat the underlying causes of the disease and not the symptoms of the disease.
On that one, I'm always torn just because, like, I imagine as a Jewish person, if someone who was like had fought a war for anti-Semitism and I had to walk past a statue glorifying them every day, I could see the resentment building up. But overall, I agree with your broader point that there's this like.
I'm for taking them down. It was in that moment of struggle where they were rioting in the streets trying to make a political change. They were trying to make these temporary autonomous zones and really change society. And then it got led off into let's tackle statues.
Right.
And it actually corresponded with the activists left from campuses taking charge, at least in Eugene, more, and it just became it was sort of like step one back towards the Democratic Party as far as I was concerned. But anyway, that's just but there's room for disagreement. But obviously, you want to get rid of those statues because it's just not pleasant to have them around.
Well, yeah, no, I don't. I don't think I have a coherent stance on this because I found it. I agree that it doesn't accomplish anything on their own. But when I watched them fall, I just felt like part of me was like, this is totally justified. We have such a broken sense of our own history that people still celebrate this. And I don't really, if I was a resident of one of these cities, I would get fed up because there'd been such pushback and such an attempt to keep them up. But I do think you're right in general. If there's this idea that we can sort of censor or destroy or race train our way out of the problems we're in, and that's just delusional.
My problem is I'm in Portland, Oregon, where things went way off the rails. So like the statue downtown of a deer got destroyed.
Was the deer racist?
I think the deer was racist, okay. Yeah, but that was due to they found that out through an implicit bias test. but the Abraham Lincoln got toppled, and I got to a point before it really took off, and as far as it did, that I thought, well, the true aim should be to destroy all representational art. Yeah, only abstract.
We wouldn't have gotten into this Dr. Seuss mess if representational art hadn't been discovered thousands of years ago. So I think you're completely right.
Right. We should become total abstract modernist artists only. And
if we were all one-dimensional points, we wouldn't be able to have problematic beliefs because we wouldn't have brains.
Yeah, you take it too far. Okay, so let me see if I have another question I'd written down in advance. So one of the other things you brought up in your book about the way that these ideas from social psychology take hold is that we all like simple stories, simple explanations for complex problems. And I think that's true. On the other hand, I feel I'm someone who loves a simple story, particularly one particular simple story. Capitalism is to blame for everything. And when I see a social problem, I think, there's a tendency of the rate of profit to decline. Right. There it is in action again. And I don't want to give that up. I do think that sometimes I think that we're too hard on reductionists sometimes as well. Like it's good to try to reduce social problems down so that we can understand them better. That I'm for that kind of reductionist impulse. And people who, in general, I find people who are against that kind of reductionist impulse generally like to just hold on to their preconceptions and then create mystification to justify it. They don't want to have these. But I'm going too far in the opposite direction. But I'm just trying to push against this idea that in and of itself is always a problem.
Well, so if the social psychologists in my book, instead of their own fixations on primes and biases, had spent all this time, I mean, this is a more activist stance, but been like, we just want poor people to have more money. We literally will do anything to make them have more money. And that would be a perfectly fine thing to reduce things to, because if people have more money, a lot of problems solve themselves. So my gripe, I think if you're trying to understand school inequality, money is part of the problem. Giving, a family more money for tutoring or more instruction or whatever will help. But part of the reason I'm a shit lib rather than like a Marxist is like, I just, sometimes when I hear that storytelling of like the exact connection between capitalism and education, maybe I'm just not smart enough or like haven't done the reading, but sometimes I feel like it's a little bit more complicated even than that. So reducing it to that, I don't like that. I do like reducing things overall policy issues to giving people more money because I'm a big believer in that.
So the thing that when it comes to education that you are unsure of is this story that if people are poor, they're not going to do as well in educational institutions than they would if they had more wealth. That seems like too simple a story. Is that what you're saying?
No. That I think that's right. I think oftentimes, I think that's part of it. But I think when you look at the tangle of reasons for like the wealth, standardized test performance gap, whatever you think of those tests, it's a little bit more than just money. It's things like social I mean, I guess as I'm saying this, I realize like I grew up in a family with two working parents who had time to read to me or have a babysitter when they weren't around. So that that does reduce to money. So a lot of it does, I guess, reduce to money.
Yeah. Well, I'm not. It depends on what you want to explain. Like if you want to explain the gap in in test scores, probably starting with yards of linen and coats and commodity relation, it might be backing up too far.
Right.
But I would do it anyway. But nonetheless, it's probably not the best approach. But I would say that for me, the question about education is, what are we trying to get education to do?
Yeah.
Because I think the emphasis on education is itself ideological, because we assume that if we got the test scores up and everyone could get into good colleges, there would be a market for a bunch of highly educated workers, which there wouldn't necessarily be.
I cite a really good sort of education writer, David Lavery, who makes the point that if tomorrow every working class kid had a college degree, the sort of credential floor would bump up and rich people would come up with something. There's always going to be this thing where like rich people will find a way to get the new, better credential and have more opportunities. So in that sense, I agree that there's like something fundamentally, it can both be true that we should level out educational opportunity, but also that like it's never going to be the case that like everyone who gets a college degree can then get a great job. Yeah,
and I look to like the 60s as a great example of the problems of overeducation. Like around 68 in Paris, that whole student worker strike came up after about 4 or 5 years of the working classes being brought into American-style universities, especially the one that was consequential was in Nanterre. So you had these working-class kids getting a college education, realizing that they were headed back to the factories, not particularly happy with that prospect. Also, that prospect was far less secure than it had been a decade earlier. While the unemployment rate in Paris was, by our standards, really low, it was still much higher than it had been for a while. And so you had a lot of resentment and dissatisfaction with French society and with bourgeois society, let's say, that came up through working class universities. So I'm all for educating the working class, but not in order to fix capitalism, but to break it.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so listen, we've been talking for about 35 minutes or 32 minutes. So let's talk a little bit about you as a public figure on social media and online and through the media and your writing, and then we'll close out, and then we'll do one more session, and we'll really talk about the juicy gossip side for the patrons. So people who pay $5 a month can get to hear the relatively mindless
my
stuff.
true thoughts on marginalized groups is what we'll do.
Yeah, no. Well, here's what's going to happen in the parrot room. I'm going to go after you like you've never been gone after before.
You bigot.
That's right. And you're going to defend yourself. No. But how connected are the ideas in your new book to your own experience online and with let's say the rad lib left to the actual left? Like, do you think that your experiences are pushing you to be more critical of the establishment liberal ideas out in the world?
I mean, absolutely. So what's funny is until maybe 3 weeks ago, I was like, oh, nice, the book is coming out. I can get away from this culture war bullshit. And it hasn't worked out that way. The book is mostly, the chapter on race makes an argument about the limitations of liberal theorizing on race at the moment and sort of this hyper individualistic thing that people ranging from D'Angelo to the IIT people do. Mostly to the extent the book is political, it's just like, it's in favor of actual redistribution and not Band-Aid solutions favored often by sort of corporate liberal types. I don't think there's a connection between the book and my travails online. That stems mostly from like a few stories I wrote about youth gender dysphoria that, in my view, have been a little bit, what's a diplomatic way to say this? A little bit misrepresented or exaggerated, and that has led to a group of people online, on Twitter especially.
It's been more than a little bit misrepresented, right? I mean, it's been very systematically and repeatedly misrepresented what your views are.
I think so, yes. Some people would disagree. And what sucks about this is like there's completely legitimate critiques one could make about my work, which maybe we'll talk about for the patrons. But it's become this weird thing where I'm sort of there was just a big campaign to get me booted entirely from Substack, where there was no mention of there being actual right-wing figures on Substack who really are skeptical, I think, of trans rights. I'm not saying they should be booted either, but there's just like such a weird focus on a few of us who like, the limits of my skepticism are like, I think if you're going to put a 10-year-old on puberty blockers or a 13-year-old on hormones, they should be well assessed, and we should make sure their mental health is in a good place. These are completely mainstream beliefs among clinicians who do this for a living, or like the good ones. But on Twitter, there's just this weird disconnect where it's considered Hitlerian almost to suggest that.
Well, it's complicated, right? Because on the one hand, there are many kids who may be suffering from gender dysphoria and who could be treated through transgender gender reassignment therapies, not necessarily surgery. They might be good candidates for it, but they come up in a family where those kinds of solutions are verboten.
Yeah.
They have parents that aren't very supportive, and they want to have an easier path towards getting the treatment they need than they might have if there were without certain kinds of legislation that would or policies.
Well, and that's the legitimate risk of this conversation, which is if you don't have it the right way, it's a very easy thing for the right to latch on to and overstate. And I did a newsletter article about how horrible these bills in conservative states are, trying to completely outlaw youth gender transition, outlaw puberty blockers, outlaw hormones. That's horrible, and that's going to cause a lot of harm. That said, if you're a conservative and you look at mainstream media and you see laughably superficial coverage of this issue, this is a big medical decision. We don't know we know the long-term effects of some of these medicines, but not all of them, and it's a big deal. But I think for kids with really bad dysphoria, I would take that trade-off if I had a kid and they had severe dysphoria. But you need to talk about, in a country with as shitty a mental health system and health system as the U.S., where it's so hard to get a good doctor for anything, the idea that we shouldn't critically talk about the state of transgender medicine, which is a burgeoning field that you can actually make a lot of money on very easily these days. I don't like that. I don't trust doctors to always know what they're doing, and I don't know why we should defer to them when there's some bad ones out there. So that's my
have a personal story. I always like to insert personal stories that kind of verifies what you're saying, but I'm going to save it for the parrot room.
There we
go. Behind. But what I will say is that it seems to me you're absolutely right that, I mean, the thing about our medical system is that there aren't universal standards.
No, there's not.
And approaches. So like when you're talking about what does it take to transition, what are the barriers to transitioning, how scrupulous are doctors and nurses when they're evaluating patients, there's not one answer to that.
No.
Right?
Well, not only that, but it's the far end of the spectrum from something like diabetes, where it's well understood and well studied. And like even a underfunded rural health clinic, if they have basic supplies, they can help you manage their diabetes. There are psychologists with no experience in this issue realizing it's a trendy issue. As Erica Anderson is a trans woman who's a clinician who I interviewed for my own podcast, and she's great. She says this is trendy. Everyone's trying to get into it and take advantage of it for their own careers. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to assess kids. They don't know how to deal with co-occurring mental health problems. Any conceivable shortcoming in their technique is there, and I think we should worry about that. But the problem is, then the right swoops in and says, okay, we should ban this medicine, which is not the right approach either.
Right. Yeah. I'm reminded of, when the pandemic hit, I read a book about the 1918 Spanish influenza, and it was really not only about that, but about the way medicine changed from the 19th to the 20th century. And in the 19th century, to be a doctor, you had to go to school for 6 weeks and read some books and pay for a diploma or something like that. And only in the 20th century did it become really a professionalized scientific medical, profession. And it seems like when you say, oh, you can be a therapist and not have any real training on this and hang your shingle to try to treat trans people, it seems like a throwback to the 19th century to a kind of pre-scientific approach to medicine.
Yeah, and of course, I'm not saying that these are like unlicensed. They have a therapy license, but they have no specific training in a incredibly complex and high stakes area of, say, adolescent psychology.
Yeah, and the other thing about therapy is that there are all these different levels of therapy. Like there's a social worker, there's a psychologist, a therapist, and who are you dealing with when you're approaching a therapist is actually sometimes difficult to figure out for a layperson. Those are the real issues that are out there for people. They're not easy to solve. And then there's the online community, which is coming after you, which doesn't want these. I mean, for some good justifiable reasons, they don't want a complicated story. But on the other hand, they're targeting you in ways that they wouldn't maybe even target an actual right-wing social conservative who really thought that, I don't know, that transgenderism is a sign of the apocalypse and the collapse of Western civilization.
Right.
They don't go after that person. They go after you.
No.
Why do you think that is?
Because they can hurt me. Like I was ranting about this yesterday. GLAAD put me on a list of anti-LGBT figures alongside Falwellian figures, and they literally just took sort of 3 debunked internet rumors about me and posted them as true. That could potentially hurt my career for the outlets I want to write for. Nothing GLAAD says will hurt the career of an evangelical conservative who can just write whatever for whatever website, WorldNet Daily. Also, I think there's a sense of moral contagion where when we have people in our own communities who we think are impure, some like deeply fucked up evolutionary part of our brain is like, we need to get the intruders out. They're not really one of us. In a way, we're not as scared of like those people across the hill over there. They're not as imminent a threat. I think that's silly because right-wing conservatism does way more damage to America, at least on this issue, than whatever I am, center-left shitlibism. When it comes to risks to transgender healthcare, I don't think it's the right choice to go after me, but of course I would say that.
Yeah, right. Well, I agree that it's not the right choice to go after you. And the reason I think that, even if you're wrong about this issue, is that it actually empowers critics of transgender people to target someone like you who's raised difficult issues that we don't really have good answers for. Yeah. I mean, that's one reason why it's a bad idea to go after you.
Well, I get these emails that drive me crazy where they'll say, man, transgender activists are crazy. And I always say the same thing. No, the average transgender activist is like trying to get like fair housing ordinances or help people stay out of a homeless shelter. What goes on online is such a tiny tip of the full community and is not representative of it. And that's like saying the 10 most online black activists represent black activism in the U.S. I don't like that. I think it misrepresents what the community is, because the average trans person is just, they want the same stuff all of us do, plus like whatever medical care they need. So sorry.
Yeah, I mean, often, that's fine. I mean, often enough, the people who are most vocal about this online aren't trans or aren't really activists. They're just like me. They're just hyper online, people. Often they're media personalities.
Yes.
Blue check marks. It's not actually about the activist work. Activist work is boring.
It's not on Twitter. It mostly does not take place on Twitter.
No. And what does take place on Twitter is not actually activism, or at least not at first. And the degree to which it does become activism, I'm usually against it. If you can take something that's a hashtag, turn it into an idea, and then sell it to the UN, then something's wrong with the UN. All right. Well, listen. Let's stop here, and I'm going to go refill my coffee cup, and then we'll start again, and we'll say things that will get us canceled.
It's going to be so offensive that if you're considering buying a subscription just for this, you should, because you won't hear it otherwise, and it's going to be crazy.
Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.